I love how you brought up the idea of piano exercises and grammatical exercises. Maybe at heart, education is a spiritual exercise. If we think like, what does it mean to say that we have a spirit? That's our intellect, that's our will, that's our ability to think and love and choose to act. And so the way that we exercise our ability to think and love and choose to act, these are spiritual exercises. And in a way, that's what education is. It's we have a vision for how we want our students to exercise spiritually, to use their intellect and their will. And we help them to build that up
Right.
through the spiritual exercises that is education.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brett Sockold, and I'm delighted today to be joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Andrew Salzmann, who is at Benedictine in Kansas. Andy, welcome to the show.
Brett, it's good to see you again. I always enjoy a chance to get to talk.
So we had an encounter that is rooted in, I'll tell the story. So if you're watching this on Substack or wherever, you might know that I used to have an online community and a platform called Circle, and I had people do presentations that we called community showcases. And those are still available if you want to go find them on the Substack. And Andy did the very first one, and it was really exciting. And some of my partners watched it and said, oh, we like this guy. We're going to invite him. So it's Fall River, Massachusetts, had invited me to speak a few years ago, and they want to keep the momentum going. And they thought Dr. Salzmann would be a great place, a great person to continue that work. And after Andy's presentation for them, we had a bit of a panel where I went back just virtually. I joined the panel virtually, and we got to talk about some of the work Andy was doing. And we just found so many connections that we said, well, we got to talk about this stuff. So anyways, that's the backstory. If you want to see Andy's presentation, you can go sign up for the full membership on Substack. But this podcast is free for everyone. And so we're delighted to talk. And we were thinking, like, there's so many connections we made. But I thought that the question that actually captured the theme for all of these is a very, very basic question, which is, what is an education? So let's start with that, Andy, and maybe tell us a little bit about some of the courses you teach and that lead you into this kind of thinking. But then more generally, what is an education?
I mean, I'm blessed to be teaching at Benedictine College, which is this kind of small liberal arts school in Kansas. And what that means is I teach a bunch of different classes. I teach American Catholic history, and I teach moral theology, and I teach Trinitarian theology, and I teach sacraments and liturgy. And so you end up exposed to a lot of stuff from all across the theological world. And then I had the opportunity to start a master's program in kind of classical liberal education. And so for that class, I teach kind of what is a human person? And that's a whole semester. And I teach a history of education. So I think like one of the things that like Brett and I think we've both found is when you read broadly across a bunch of stuff, you're just able to kind of pick up themes or cross-pollinate themes that like lead in interesting places. So that's what I do at Benedictine. And so we wanted to think about like, what is an education? And I think one author I've been able to read who has been really influential for me is Charles Taylor, and kind of like a fellow Canadian, right? And he has this really interesting kind of way of talking about the human person, the human subject, what makes a subject. And he talks about how we get kind of practices, disciplines that help us to have patterns of thinking and feeling and acting. And I think one way to get at this question of like what is an education is to say, how are we shaping our students? What activities, what practices, what things are we doing with our students to shape how they think and how they feel, how they love, which is not the same as feeling, and therefore how they choose to act. So, one way of thinking about, I think maybe a very holistic way of thinking about what is an education is, what do we do? What are the things that we do to give our students habits of thinking, feeling, acting? Yeah. What do you think of that?
Well, so it reminds me of some language that you used in our earlier conversation that led to this, which is conceptualizing education as exercise. The idea, right? So that if you think about, right, we usually think physical exercise, though you can have my kids when they do piano, they have exercises.
Yeah, yeah.
Or even when you do grammar, you can do exercises. But we usually think
Right.
of the analogy with the physical training of the body, right? That
Yeah.
in but and training in the body is an important part of an education. We're body and soul. But mostly what we're thinking about when we think about an education are the other features that make a human being, the features of the soul, things like will and intellect.
Yeah.
And how do you exercise your will, and how do you which goes to your point about love,
Yeah.
right? And how do you exercise your intellect, which goes to questions about knowledge and understanding and that kind of thing.
So we could think about maybe something else we could call education. I love how you brought up the idea of piano exercises and grammatical exercises. Maybe at heart, education is a spiritual exercise. If we think like, what does it mean to say that we have a spirit? That's our intellect, that's our will, that's our ability to think and love and choose to act. And so the way that we exercise our ability to think and love and choose to act, these are spiritual exercises. And in a way, that's what education is. It's we have a vision for how we want our students to exercise spiritually, to use their intellect and their will. And we help them to build that up
Right.
through the spiritual exercises that is education.
And as you're saying that, one of the things that occurs to me is when we think about physical exercise, if I want to bench press 200 pounds, I know that I can't just like think of myself as the kind of person who benches 200 and then walk into the gym and do it.
Yeah.
And I'm not just born as the kind of person who benches 200 pounds. Very few people are born like that.
Yeah.
But rather, I have a potential within me that I can develop if
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do the certain kinds of things. And I think our contemporary image of the human person very often, even though we know that about like physical capacities, we very often imagine spiritual capacities as
Yeah.
sort of innate and given or not. Like you're a patient person or you're not a patient person. And we don't say like, if you conduct yourself in certain ways, you
Yeah.
can become a patient person. Like
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
rarely think like that. But if most of these things are simply given or not given,
Yeah.
then education is like, I don't even know what it is.
Yeah.
Like what if the creature you have before you already has its preset options from the womb, whereas a Catholic vision imagines a human person as like, in a certain sense, a bunch of potentialities that can be developed, right? That's not the whole of what a Catholic anthropology is, but
No,
it's
but
a core part of it.
yeah. No, I think you're hitting on something really important, which is it's so intuitive. We all know that to grow physically, we have to do exercises. And we don't just think that physically someone is just born the way they're going to be. And it's so intuitive that musically, you have to do exercises to become good at music. And no one thinks that, you just sit down at a piano and start pounding out music. At least no one who's raised a kid who's gone through piano lessons. But for whatever reason, we do tend to think, like you're saying, that some of these spiritual powers, patience or love or what have you, that those
Honesty,
are,
generosity, prudence, like anything.
yeah, there is a danger, or there's a temptation to think that people just kind of are born that way.
Right.
And I don't want to, I mean, I don't mean to be like too much of a Catholic theologian, but I think that we can kind of put a finger on where that comes from. I think that in Anglophone cultures, in the English speaking world, the default view of the human person is very affected by the Protestant Reformation. That we have a kind of a default way of looking at the human person, and that default way of looking at the human person comes to us a lot. It was very influenced by uh, the Protestant Reformation. Even when people aren't Protestant anymore,
Right.
those kind of deeper, unexamined kind of presuppositions about what people are, how people work, I think there's still ways in which that's influenced by the Protestantism that once defined the English-speaking world.
So let's draw some connecting lines there between, like, so fundamental questions that the Protestants and Catholics disagree about at the Reformation, right? Faith and works, predestination, the possibility of growth in virtue. These are kind of the background pieces that would lead to a different attitude towards whether spiritual powers are something that grow like our muscles or our finger dexterity on a keyboard or whatever, right? Like, and like, we don't want to overdraw these to the point where we're denying like what Protestantism actually got right. Like, grace is a gift. That's not wrong. But how does grace being a gift relate to like things like human effort or human growth and development? Like, how does grace relate to those things, right?
Yeah, I think those are the, central questions to ask. So if you have a certain kind of Protestant view of justification, that would say you don't have to become a better person to be loved by God, right? Like, in a sense, that's what justification by grace alone is saying. Justification by grace alone is saying that we're all sinful, maybe even totally depraved, but we're all sinful, and we're not going to get better. Protestantism, kind of, that's the Protestant idea. Deus et peccator. We're not going to get better, but God, his grace means that he, on his side, is going to love us as if we were good without us needing to change. And so we don't change. There isn't spiritual life in that kind of a Protestant vision. Does not envision growth per se.
Right.
Or at least not growth that will make us more pleasing to God.
Okay.
And so that was, in a way, I think you could say that's the big argument that Catholics and Protestants had. Is God's grace just his opinion about us? He has a nicer opinion about us than he needs to. He loves us more than he should. Or does God's grace change us? Does it affect us? Does it bring forth new powers and call forth new excellence in the human soul? And that was always, as you know, that was the Catholic idea. The Catholic idea is that if we're going to become pleasing to God, if God is going to look at us and be pleased, then that kind of justification is going to happen because of sanctification, because God looks at us and finds new perfections that he's given to us through his grace, right? Like, we don't make ourselves pleasing to God with our own effort. That's the damnable heresy of Pelagianism. I always tell my students, whenever we mention Pelagianism, to boo or hiss, to hit home the idea that, we don't make ourselves excellent in the Christian moral life. But Catholicism does insist, and especially after the Reformation, after this fight with Protestantism, we articulate even more clearly that growing closer to God is going to mean a growth in virtue. And this growth in virtue will happen in natural ways and in supernatural ways. In natural ways, God gives us all sorts of natural powers. natural powers that we exercise in order to become better at. So we always talk about fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence as kind of four of these great important cardinal virtues. We can all become better at being punctual through practice. We have that ability in us. God gives us the potential to be punctual, and we actualize that by making a point of being on time over and over and over again until it becomes second nature or habitual. So we have to exercise that potency in order for it to become an act and then a habit.
Right.
And even with God's grace, right? God gives us charity. God gives us love. We can't make that happen on our own. We can't earn that. We can't cause that. But like our nature, he gives it to us. And then it's our job to make that gift of God's unearned love, to make it our own by, in the Augustinian tradition, we would say, by exercising it, by doing things with it.
So, yeah. And so let's move from that basic framing to like thinking about like school, like, right. So you're going to do grammar exercises or math exercises or whatever it is that you're going to do in school. What does a Catholic vision do to shape the way those kinds of things are approached? And in your history of Catholic education, you look in particular at the Jesuits, who have a long history of excellence in education. You can nuance this for us, but it's something like the Jesuits start schools for the poor everywhere they go, and within 2 generations, they're schools for the rich. Yeah. Because the rich are like, those are the best schools. We're going to send our kids there.
They're doing something really right. Yeah.
Right. Which, I mean, that's a little overdrawn, but something like that actually happens, right? In the first
definitely
Jesuit
a pattern.
schools.
Yeah, that's right.
So what are they doing? Like, the Jesuits emerge, in fact, like right out of the historical time period you're discussing.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? It's where the Catholic vision has to be clarified because of the Protestant challenge. And Jesuits are sort of like first responders to this kind of emergency. And then one of the things they do in the first generation is start schools that have to be rooted in this anthropology that is like the burning question in the church right now, right?
An anthropology that is emphasizing the importance of doing so that we develop the habits by which we make God's grace our own, the habits by which we are transformed by making God's grace our own and perfected, and thus become pleasing to God. So the spiritual formation of the Jesuits is especially aware that if we are going to kind of develop, educate, form, perfect the human person, it has to happen through actions that we lead our students through this idea of exercise. Let's talk about exercise. I think one of the things that when you look at it from this point of view, education is about forming the person, the student, forming their mind, their body, their soul through doing or through exercise. Maybe let's start by saying what that means, what that helps us to see that doesn't matter, the thing that's not important. And the thing that's not important about education, when you frame it from the perspective of exercise, helping students to exercise their potential, what doesn't matter so much is the outcome or the stuff that you produce or the result of your efforts. And I don't want that to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter if you get a bad grade on a test. But what I'm trying to say is that, let's use an example, like St. John Vianney. He, the famous kind of parish priest in France, people flocked to him to go to confession. I think so many people wanted to go to confession with him that the French railroad built a new stop right in Vianney just for him. So thousands of people are going to him because, he's hearing confessions and is having great results, but he isn't holy because of the great outcome here. Lots of people are coming to him to confession. If John Vianney becomes holy, he becomes holy not because lots of people want to go to confession to him, not because he's successful. He becomes holy by being really patient and suffering through all these, confessions, by entering into that exercise of hearing confessions. His holiness depends on how well he disciplines himself through his interactions with his parishioners. Or like a parent, for a parent, you're not, God doesn't judge us, doesn't judge a parent based on the outcome. How does the child, when he or she turns 18, keep going to mass? That's beyond our control. But what makes a good parent is the holiness of the parent depends on how we use the opportunity to raise our kids so that we can grow in virtue and we can help try to lead them to grow in virtue. So when you emphasize this idea of exercise, then it's less product oriented.
Right.
And so applied to education, that means that if you have a kid in school, every day I get home and right in front of my plate at dinner is a big pile of worksheets, right? And we talk through the worksheets and like, oh yeah, I'm so glad you got the math facts. Good job. Oh, this is a really nice, 5-paragraph essay. Nice work. But it's important to kind of like see how those products point to our children's growth. But they don't really matter. The world doesn't, like, the last thing the world needs is another 5-paragraph essay. What matters about the 5-paragraph essay is how our students grow as they write it. Right. But the world doesn't need another 5-paragraph essay. And so we can kind of, by emphasizing the importance that education is about exercising our faculties, we can shake a productionist mindset. There's a kind of a productionist mindset that is easy for us to fall into, where school is where I get work done. Right. But school is where I do work that forms me. And that's the danger. I don't know that the church has spelled this out about, schoolwork per se, but we do spell it out very nicely about professional work. So right. In his encyclical Exercens, John Paul II had said, there's two sides to work. There's the objective kind of product of your work. You worked on something, here it is, now it's done. And that has economic value, and that's great. Sell it. But then there's the subjective or the formative side of work. By working on this project, I grew in patience. Or by teaching this course, I grew in my ability to organize myself. So education, especially K through 12 education, there's not a lot of value in the stuff that we produce. No, there's not a market value for the 5-paragraph essay, but there's just immense formative value that comes from doing that work.
Right.
And I want to frame it like that, kind of keeping in mind that like the product that we produce in our schools, that the students produce in schools, the worksheets and the papers and all of this, they're wonderful when the kids do well and try. But if we focus too much on just producing the product, that's where the temptation to cheat comes in.
Right.
A student who doesn't understand that the point of the work is formative, is to exercise their intellect and to exercise their will. That's when we become the most tempted to cheat. And this is also why like some assignments are maybe more frustrating than others. Because you get home, I get home from work and I'm looking at my kids' assignments, and like there's like crossword puzzles or word searches, and you kind of wonder what,
Is this the best use of our time?
yeah, like what faculties did this develop? I wonder. I mean,
Right.
I'm not trying to be too punchy, but
Well,
yeah.
well, three examples have emerged in my mind, and I want to take them in order. I
Yeah.
think they work well in order. I think on one place where we actually see this clearly is in athletics. So we know that winning isn't the point of high school athletics.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? We know that becoming a certain kind of person through practicing and playing and becoming a good teammate and developing discipline and developing something, a virtue like magnanimity, which allows you to be gracious when you lose and when you win, like all that kind of, that's what we're doing. At the same time, we know that you get the discipline and the virtues and all the other pieces if you work towards winning. Like you don't try not to win.
That's good.
Right?
That's good.
Right? Because winning isn't the ultimate goal. It doesn't mean you don't try to do it, because if you don't try to do it, you won't get the other things. And I think it's the same with the crossword puzzle, right? Of course, you're going to try to get it right. It doesn't actually matter in the final analysis if you get it right. But if you don't try to get it right, you're not going to get the thing you were supposed to get from it, right?
Right.
And then to your point about cheating, when you lose track of that, right? When the winning becomes the goal for its own sake and not for the goods that come from pursuing winning in a just, virtuous way, well, then cheating starts to become justified in sports, right? And then, but that's the same in anything. So here's my second example as you were talking, because I'm drafting this week, and by the time this podcast is released, this newsletter will have been out for a while. But right now I'm drafting a newsletter on social studies, and one of the questions in it is voting. Now, if the goal of voting, this one is very easy to think, that the goal of the democratic process is to elect the right person or party or platform, right? And so getting the right people in power, it becomes very easy to justify all kinds of things.
That's
which, I mean, it could be justifying like subverting the democratic process. Maybe you justify that at the systemic level. But what is much easier to do, in fact, it's all in our culture, I see it more often than not, it's easier to do it than to not do it, is to justify your own decision to yourself in a way that excuses the party or candidate that you chose to vote for from something that is inexcusable. You say, I can't vote for party X because they're just awful. Therefore, these awful things that are not justifiable for party Y are in fact justifiable because of the unjustifiable stuff on the other side. And like, as soon as you do that, you're actually, you're compromising your soul. Like you are willing to tell a lie about what is good. Now, what you should say as a Catholic who votes for something that is not, and we will vote for something that is not justifiable, because that's, or we won't vote. Those are the two options.
You might vote for someone who says or is promoting a policy that
But we will not vote for it because it's unjustifiable. And we have to be able to keep that straight in our heads, that I'm voting for things not because they're bad, but because of a prudential judgment that included a lot of complex details, and because in the end I determined that a vote for the other side was worse. I will be voting for things. And then our discourse would allow us to criticize the people we voted for and get better options the next time. But when we either subvert the democratic process by justifying cheating because it's so important, or when we just do the more subtle version of lying to ourselves and therefore eliminating or degrading our own virtue, we've lost the plot. Because it's so hard to think of it, but you're exactly right. The goal in voting was not primarily to elect the right person or party. The goal in voting was to make a just and virtuous decision, and the process of discernment should have made me a more virtuous person. And if I do that over and over and over again, and enough of my fellow citizens do that over and over again, we're going to get much better candidates and parties next time around. But if we keep making the compromise, we're going to keep getting worse and worse. Anyways,
I love
rant,
that
but I
example
think it's
because,
applicable.
again, like in that example, the process of becoming an informed voter, right, is that's the most important thing. That you have a citizenry that is habitually aware of the issues and making the just choice as best as they can judge about those issues. That is kind of a result of years of kind of study and formation. And if your goal is to have an educated and a just citizenry, then you care more about forming voters and their consciences than you care about who wins a given election. And a society in which those, those virtues of engagement, kind of being informed and being just are present in the citizenry, that matters much more than the given winner of a particular election. And as you form the citizenry, God willing, you'll get better results from your elections. There's not a complete divorce.
Right. Just like the high school athletics. If you do all the things right, you're going to win more games than if you don't.
The goal is to win. You get to winning by practicing and not by cheating. And, if you practice really hard, you're not guaranteed that you'll win. But over time, you'll become the kind of people who will be excellent enough to win.
Right.
If you write a paper, it's not that one paper that matters. But as you build up the habits to write clearly and well, then over time, you'll write more excellent papers because you have become an excellent paper writer.
Right.
If you have the habits of kind of like discerning the correct issues and judging about them in a just way, then over time, you're going to have a smarter and more just society. But it's never about the value of just one piece of output.
Exactly. Yes.
It's always about the formative process that makes you into the kind of person who can produce quality output.
Right.
Or, an emphasis on the formational person, kind of the formational side of things.
Right.
And I think that's why we failed in a real way, because I'm afraid that we are in the process of failed to justify to people why they need to be able to write, why the paper is not a dead tool.
Right.
I think it's very easy, or the essay, it's very easy to say, well, why have the kids write essays when AI can write an essay for them? But
and that was my third example was so I was going to go phys ed, voting, and then AI. So that's exactly
go ahead.
Well, go ahead. I mean, that's exactly. So if the question is, if we are convinced that the output or the product is the goal,
right,
then very soon humans become obsolete, actually. And I just saw a joke. The Onion did like a false mock-up interview with Sam Altman, like the CEO of OpenAI, right? And the question is like, what are human, like, if once AI can do all the things, what are the humans going to do? And he's like, humans have always and will always be important to watch advertisements.
Right. That's right. But what that's what you would end up saying if you take a productionist view of the human person to its natural conclusion. Right? Like human beings were for doing things. Now the machines do it better. So sit back and watch a commercial, right?
Right.
Whereas the kind of the perspective of Catholic anthropology would say, we have a nature and an intellectual, a spiritual, a physical nature, and we are inclined to act in certain ways. And when we exercise these potentials, these inclinations, when we exercise them, then we grow, we build virtues, we develop ourselves, and we become happier. This is, maybe a different way of thinking about happiness, but, for the point of view of Thomas Aquinas, happiness is performing your proper act well. And so a human being who realizes a physical potentiality in an excellent way, who's a great runner, is happy while they are running. A person who realizes a human capacity like creative writing well is happy while they're writing. They're achieving their proper end.
Right.
A person who realizes the human capacity for love well is happy when they are doing something to will the good of the other. I'm happy in some way. I'm very tired, but in some way, I'm very happy when I'm up at 3 a.m. with my kid, because by trying to help let's say they're sick or whatever, kid, I feel like a father, a tired father, but I feel like a father.
Right.
And that makes me happy.
Right.
Maybe emotionally happy. Maybe I'll have to wait 20 years and look back on that to feel emotionally happy about it. But I'm realizing a human potential.
Right.
And that's the thing that's missing, is that, or, from your kind of like fake Sam Altman kind of like headline, we don't exist to buy things off of commercials, to watch advertisements. That's a false road to happiness. And we see that.
Right.
But we exist, to realize our potentials by exercising them, and by exercising them to become stronger, to become more complete, to become more perfected. And that, to loop it back a little, that's what we're trying to do with education. Education is not a productionist situation where like we just try to pump out essays and worksheets. I have a friend who talks, who criticizes the worksheet sweatshop approach to grade school. But what we're trying to do is form people through carefully chosen activities that demand effort, but an effort that's new and refines our capacities. So we, sometimes we think someone like we were saying before, patient people were just born patient, or smart people are just born smart. But no, a Catholic anthropology would say kind of what, I don't know if you saw the book. There was a book that came out a couple years ago called Outliers, the Story of Success, by a guy named Malcolm Gladwell.
Another Canadian. You only read Canadians.
Apparently I only do. See, the thing is, you never know when someone's Canadian,
no,
right?
We're sneaky
like until they
way.
say about or something.
Yeah. But in text, you can't even tell.
Wow. Yeah, there you go.
We spell it the same. But anyway.
Anyways,
Outliers. Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah. So he makes the point, like he says, anyone who you see in the Olympics or like the National Spelling Bee or whatever, I assume they have one of those in Canada, you can be tempted to think, oh, well, they're just naturally good spellers or naturally good swimmers. But he says, no, being excellent at anything, he picks a number. He says it takes 10,000 hours of practice. I don't know if that's true, but the anthropology underneath it, I vouch for 100%. The more that you do something, the more excellent you become at it. And if you don't exercise the capacity, you don't build that virtue, you don't build that habit, you don't become great at it. And I think Catholics, I think everyone, as we've been saying, sees that with music. I think that we see that with maybe math or science. I hope that we do. But sometimes even in like a Catholic school, we do kind of like, there are other areas where we don't maybe appreciate that things require practice, that things require exercise to become good at.
Well, so I would say math teachers and art teachers are the teachers I hear most often lament the idea that kids come into their class with an attitude from maybe one or two early experiences where they think, I'm good at art or I'm not good at art. I'm just like, I was just born good at art. And the same thing with math. I'm either a math person
or I'm not a math person.
I'm not a math person. And math teachers pull their hair out because they're like, look, not everyone is going to be a math genius. Fair enough. Anybody can get better at math. And right. Art teachers will tell you the same thing. Like kids are like, oh, I just can't draw. Well, maybe you'll never be Picasso, right? But you can draw, you can improve. And this comes to something else, which I think is really valuable for us. Some of us are going to be like virtuosos at something. right?
Yeah.
A high school quarterback who's like generational talent. We've never seen anything like that at our high
Yeah.
school.
Yeah.
Okay, that comes along once in a while. Some kid for whom math is just like second nature. It just, everything clicks. Someone who can draw photorealistic images
Right.
without training. Okay, once in a blue moon, you have people like that. And then we, in our culture, I worry, we convince ourselves that if we're not one of those, it's almost not worth our time. And I want to
Yeah.
say, like, the bar band that
Yeah.
is like not great
Yeah.
is a really worthwhile investment of your time and energy. Like,
If you
the kind
love
of person you
being in
become.
that band, if that's a great evening, and like you are like feeling the music and people are dancing, it doesn't, again, we'd be making the productionist error if we said only the best person should do the thing.
Right.
If being in that band perfects something about the human person, our desire to make beautiful things, then therefore that makes you happy, then that is time well spent.
Right.
Even if you're never going to be a Celine Dion.
Right. Right. And this is
up.
true about so many things. This is true about all kinds of like crafting hobbies that people do.
Yeah.
You don't have to be great at them. I think about it singing in church. In some cultures, everybody sings in church because that's what you do. In our culture, half of them don't sing. Another quarter like move their lips. And then the quarter or less who actually feel comfortable singing in public because they can carry a tune are expected to sing. And like, I feel like there's something dysfunctional.
Yeah.
Both
and
about our personal development and community.
Even if you're not the best singer, you would have a better time if you were singing.
Yes. Yeah, because the goal was not great singing. The goal was singing together and praising God.
That's right.
Regardless of your
psychosomatic with your body and your heart.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so, okay, all of this is helping me loop back to a thought early that I want to get you to say more about. And it's that we are happy when we're doing. So exercise is maybe a long form of the word do.
Yeah.
But do stuff. And so to go back to the original question, like, what is education? I think an easy answer for many people in our culture, if they didn't know that it was a trick, right? But they would imagine education is basically information transfer.
Yeah.
Right. So the teacher knows things and the students should know things. And so what kind of creature are you? Well, you're some hardware, and knowledge is like some data. And it needs to be like uploaded. Right. And so we're this sort of Jamie Smith, whom you might know, the theologian James A. Smith, calls this anthropology like the head on a stick anthropology. Like human beings are just knowers. That's all they do. And knowledge is abstracted from life, activity, community, formation. It's just like humans should know things. And we reduce ourselves in our own minds to essentially like not very good computers. What is the human person? A kind of inadequate computer. That's the thing you are,
Yeah, I love this because it points out the way that we have a tendency to view ourselves by analogy with whatever the biggest technology of the moment is. And for a while, that's been computers. And so we have this kind of tendency to think that we store information and we generate it upon request. We spit it out on request. And maybe that's one of the reasons that some people who don't engage their education as closely, maybe they do that because for a very understandable reason. They're smarter than that. They know that we're not heads on a stick. And so they say, well, I don't need that. That's not what life is for. So I love that. I love that analogy. I love that you brought that out. And so we have to kind of like make sure that we deconstruct that view of education. Happiness is performing an action that human beings are inclined or created to perform. It's a question of act. It's a question of doing. And education, if it's going to be shaping us and forming us, so that we can act and so that we can do more excellently, then education is going to not be an example of passive information absorption and then, like, print out the answer on request. Education is going to have to return to our theme of exercise, is going to have to take place by not the passive consumption of information by students, but by coaching. I think, like, we realize that being excellent at a sport requires practice, and therefore the people who lead us at practice are coaches. We call them coaches because they help us to do the thing.
Right.
If we realized that learning is a question of doing, a question of intellectual and volitional actions, a question of spiritual exercise, then we would treat our teachers more like coaches. Coach, help me to do this. Watch me do it, or rather, model for me how to do it. Watch me do it. Give me feedback on how I did it. Watch me do it again.
Right.
This kind of an emphasis in education, exercitio, exercise, would mean that the teacher takes on the position of coach, helping students to do the thing. And I think, to kind of like lead, to something we mentioned earlier, in a lot of ways, that's what Jesuit pedagogy was all about. And I'm only saying was because for a long time, the Society of Jesus had a special curriculum called the Ratio Studiorum, or the Plan of Studies. And along with that, curriculum, that curricular plan, there were a couple of authors who had written companions on how to teach for Jesuits who were engaged in Jesuit schools. And, with the changes in things that students were expected to know, with the changes in the general curriculum, the Ratio Studiorum fell out of use by the 1940s or 50s. There was just too much that was different now than had been in the 1500s. So in some ways, like, I'm going to use the past tense to talk about the Jesuit pedagogy, but I don't mean that as an insult to Jesuit education today. But I think when you look back at Jesuit pedagogy, particularly during 1500 to 1950, one of the big things, or 1550 to 1950, one of the big things that they emphasize is that education is about exercise. And so, just to give an example, if you were to walk into a Jesuit classroom for literature, how would they have done a literature class? And they say, you should introduce a piece of literature with a prelection. They don't say a lecture, because a lecture sounds like that's the goal. I've written a lecture. You've come to listen to a lecture. The way that we're learning today is through the lecture. They call the little part where the teacher talks a prelection because it's a preface to the common lectio, the common reading that the class is going to do together. So a Jesuit literature class would have began with some kind of a brief introduction to the reading. And then after that, because they did the reading in Latin or Greek, after that kind of introductory lesson, the teacher would have the students read the lesson out loud, read the passage out loud. Each student would read it out loud so that you could practice saying it, practice hearing it, practice listening to it. And then they would kind of give you a bit of an overview of what the passage was going to be about. And then you would walk through kind of each word in the reading. And the teacher would call on students. The main thing that would be happening is that the teacher would say, the first word, please define the word, and then give me the kind of the present tense of the verb, and then the infinitive, and then tell me other ways that you could read it. And then they'd walk through the whole sentence. Kind of the students would be translating the sentence. The teacher would not be doing the work. but would be prompting the students to do the work. And they specifically say, if you have a student whose memory is not very good, then at the beginning of each day, call on that student to remember what you did the day before. If you have a student whose verb forms are not up to where they should be, you need to call on that student to conjugate the verb. If you have a student who is shy, you should call on that student to speak more out loud, because your job as the coach is to ask, what is it that this student needs to work on the most? If you were on the football field and you had someone who wasn't performing the way that they should perform, what you would do is you would give them all the opportunity in the world to get better at doing the thing.
Right.
And so that's what this idea of exercitio looked like in practice.
When I was listening to you describe the process, there's two competing things in my head. One is like, some kids or some people are going to hear that described and think like, that's boring. But I was actually picturing the 12 and 13-year-olds I know. And what I was seeing is, now, of course, anything can be done well or poorly, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm sure there's a huge range, but done well, I'm just picturing 12, 13, 14-year-old kids growing into their own skin, feeling competent, right? Like, I have a daughter who loves grammar, right?
Yeah.
And she knows her grammar books. She was actually training her older brother who doesn't know grammar and who needed to. She was training him, and like the joy that she had in like being able to competently articulate and explain this to someone else because she had gained the capacity through the work was like, as a parent, like that's exactly, there's this joy in like seeing your kids have that kind of potential. And the same thing is true on the sports field, right? Where the kid who's been working on, I remember a coach who I was coaching baseball with, his kid was having trouble getting a hit in baseball, right? He was striking out a lot. And then he figured something out and he went up there and he hit the ball. And like the confidence,
the crowd goes wild.
But the dad who was there, who had seen his kid go through this, and the joy on the kid's face of having put in the work then developed competence in the thing. It sounds, from a certain point of view, the work sounds boring.
Yeah.
But when you actually think about kids and the process that they go through to become competent in something, it's like not boring at all. If you know what I mean. Anyways, that was like in my head as you were describing it, right?
Yeah, I love that, because when we are excellent at something, it will always be interesting to us.
Right. Or even if we're making progress towards excellence.
Right. Yeah. When we get the kind of, I love that you use the word joy, the kind of joy or well-ordered happiness that comes from doing something well, then we'll always, that's the most engaged classroom you can have. Right.
And I'm even thinking in terms of like, as parents, how we talk to kids about school. Like when they come home and we ask about grades or whatever. Now, of course, sometimes you have to have a conversation about grades. But I wondered if, as parents, we could build the habit of talking to our kids about their experience, their growth, their competence, their enjoyment. Like if those kinds of things became the metrics for how was your day at school.
Yeah.
Rather than, it seems to me that it's relatively common that how was your day at school is either about academics in terms of like product or outcome.
Right. Did you pass?
Or it's about your social experience.
Yeah.
Were people nice to you? Did you have anyone to have lunch? Right. And like, which is like this fatal dichotomy. If kids like enjoyment of school is divorced from the academic element. And it's like, well, hopefully there's like some good social interaction to compensate for the fact that I had to learn stuff today. Like,
right. Or sit there as people talked to me.
Right.
You know? Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
But could the joy be in the process and the doing and the learning?
So, kind of in the realm of like the history of what Jesuit pedagogy did for exercitio, another example of what they do, which I remembered as you were talking, is they were really into it. They really promote kind of contests, right? So they really want to give students a chance to do the thing, exercitio, in a contest with other people. And so they'll say, if you have two students who are always rivals, hopefully friends, but still pushing each one, like doing their best and just barely pushing the other to do a little better, then you should pair those people together. My son yesterday came home and said he was talking about one of his friends. And he's really my friend, but like we always try to like compete with each other a little. And he was worried, like, is that okay? And the Jesuits would say that is perfect.
Right.
That's iron sharpens iron. So it doesn't just have to be kind of in classroom group activities. They would say there should be contests. Or even when it's not a contest with a prize, you could still, you should still pair students who are close to each other in their abilities and maybe a little competitive. Pair them together. And then another example that they give in terms of like how you write or written exercises, they say you should never ask a student to write something completely divorced from what you've been doing in class. And this is one of the benefits of having an integrated classroom where literature and composition are happening kind of in the same environment and with the same materials. But if you want students to write something, a benefit of this view of education is that you should be imitative. You should like give them kind of step-by-step examples of how to imitate something else that they're studying very closely. Because if you sit, like nothing's more stressful than sitting a kid down in front of a blank sheet of paper, right? It's at that moment where they're wondering like, should I just plug this prompt into AI? But if you can walk them through, coach them through like the kind of steps that they would take to imitate something that you've been looking at in class, the style of a particular author or the kind of argumentation of a particular author, imitate the poetry of someone else that they've been reading. They know that well because they've been reading it. And so it's less scary to say, imitate this thing that we've been reading in class because we've been studying it carefully and you're in a position to maybe not write any poem. To write a poem might be scary, but to write a poem that sounds Shel Silverstein or something like that, that's not as scary.
Right.
They can easily see or easily imagine themselves doing that thing which they've been asked to do. So they say in the world of written exercises, you want the students to write as much as they can. You want them doing, but you want them doing in a way you've prepared them to do. So thus imitative.
I think the imitative goes back to another point when we were talking about anthropology. I think we imagine in our culture that creativity is something that you're born with and that doesn't have any like antecedents in your environment. And so to be authentically creative means making something up out of nothing, which is practically impossible.
Well, I mean, and to make everything an anthropological error. But this is a romantic idea, right? This comes straight out of romanticism. That like in my heart, I find something that's just me and it's my own like particular private truth or my own particular like insight on the world. And it's my life's vocation is to take this like brilliant, unique insight that's just mine and express it to the world through my art. That's the romantic idea, but that's not how art actually works,
or how the human brain works.
Yeah, it's not how people work because everything, that we value, everything that we are able to say or to do or to express, we've learned to say or to do or to express that from our parents, from our society, from the people who we value, who we're close to. And so in the world of creativity doesn't mean like God creating ex nihilo. In the realm of human beings, from nothing comes nothing.
Right.
And so in the realm of human beings, creativity means that you've really delved into something that was great, something that was inspiring, and you've maybe rethought it in your way, but it's always growing, or it's always in conversation with a bigger
Right.
conversation, a number of other partners. I think anyone who's ever had writer's block, their professor has said, well, go read something until you get an idea.
Right.
And so, yeah, I love the opportunity to point out another anthropological error.
Right. Well, last month's episode, I was talking to Father Nick Schneider, so people who heard
Yeah.
that conversation will find this familiar. But he told a story of a great chef who was dressing a chicken in a way that it was like you have to completely debone, but then roast it as if it was a whole chicken. It's a high end, like you got to be really good at what you're doing. And
Yeah.
he said, like, people nowadays think they have to make things up, be themselves. If they did what the tradition does, and if they learned it inside out and backwards,
Yeah.
their uniqueness would shine through anyways.
Yeah.
You are already a unique person. You don't have to worry that by following a tradition, you will lose your uniqueness.
That's right. Another example would be like when you listen, like if you have a favorite music group and you listen to them talk about, like you listen to an interview with the musicians, they never say, well, I wasn't thinking anything, and then this song popped in my head.
Right.
Right? They always name their influences. And in a
Right.
way, what makes them really exciting is the fresh take that they give to their influences.
Right.
So, I mean, I listen to this Norwegian rock band that nobody's ever heard of, that they do a kind of, it's like polka, but it's rock polka. And what's exciting about it is that it's like rock polka, right? Like this is really cool. They're in conversation with some pre-existing tradition.
Right.
Or like, I remember the first time that I heard on the radio a group called Churches. And it was like being in 1980 again, even though it's a more recent song.
Right.
And what's cool about that song is this is what the 80s would sound like today. So it's a fresh take on something else. But nobody ever just kind of like wakes up one day and out comes a song.
Right. Right.
Creative input is in conversation with and imitative of a tradition.
Right. If you're familiar with a group called Greta Van Fleet, so when they first burst onto the scene, they're a bunch of teenagers. They burst onto the scene, and it was like, oh my goodness, we found lost recordings from Zeppelin.
Yeah, exactly. That feeling.
And then it's like, actually, it's a bunch of teenagers from Michigan.
Right.
Why do they sound like Zeppelin? And then when you find out, oh, their dad had like the most ridiculous vinyl collection. Like these kids have grown up with the blues and with the rock tradition, whatever.
Yeah.
From the time they were 3, like this did not come out of nowhere. Or even Zeppelin itself, like Jimmy Page put in how many hours as a studio musician playing whatever the sheet music in front of him told him to play.
Yeah.
And that's what made Zeppelin possible. Was what, and if you can, John Paul Jones starts working in a church as like a music director when he's a teenager and learning all this stuff, mostly because he wanted the money. Now, he wasn't particularly devout, but there's always the backstory, always, right?
That's right.
The most profoundly creative people you find in any field, you find this deep tradition.
And so in education, right, if we want our students to kind of habituate themselves to create, to write, to compose, then our job as educators is to help them kind of exercise the creative impulse, the creative tendency or intuition, to exercise that in gradual ways, in steps, right? And that begins kind of like with coaching them through imitation.
Right.
Like when you teach a kid how to throw a football, right? Like it's painfully slow and it's small little steps, right? Hold your hands out like this to catch it. And eventually you coach them how they're able to catch and to throw. And when we think about education as a kind of a coaching in exercise, a coaching in habits of thinking, habits of feeling, habits of acting, then we realize that in the world of written exercises, the steps we're going to begin with are very imitative. And then the Jesuits also, I love this part. The Jesuit, they also say, grading is profoundly boring. It is so boring. And I hopefully some people in your audience will find this to be like validating. It's not just in a world in which you could be watching literally anything else on YouTube that grading is boring. Even in the 19th century, when there wasn't that much, but no, they were bored to tears by it. But they say, but you have to do it. You have to do it. Because if you're not giving that careful, individualized, detailed feedback, you're not, these are my words, you're not being a coach. You're
Right.
not showing them how to do it better. Grading is about showing them how, like what they did well, affirming what they did well, but modeling for them how they could do better. And that's, yeah, I mean, it's not exciting, but it's deeply important.
I had to grade a lot of homilies and other forms of writing for the guys in
Yeah.
our diaconate formation program. And grading adults, many of whom are older than you, who are established in their careers, some of whom are grandparents already, is a different game.
Yeah.
But I had a very simple method, and it was like, I've got these guys for 4 years. I don't need to fix everything this month, right? And it was like, I'm going to write one paragraph about things you did well and one paragraph about things you could do better next time.
Yeah.
And when some guys who struggled with writing, that method of like, here's one thing you can think about next time to improve your writing, you do that 20 times over the course of a few years, that works. Like and I have very specific things that I saw guys grow in. You can absolutely do it. We got to bring this plane into land. And so you recently, just in the last couple of minutes, you said practice. Oh, I can't remember what it was. Thinking, feeling, doing.
Yeah.
And I want to put one more thing on that list and let you kind of riff on that as we wrap up, which is practice loving. The human creature is the creature that loves, that is made for love, that will not be satisfied without learning how to love well and to receive love. And so there's a way in which, underneath all the other things, when you're training someone to think or to do or whatever, or to feel, and you specified at the very beginning that feeling and loving aren't the same. So you can make the connection between them, how one relates to one another, but also thinking and doing. So let's say we're training people to think, to feel, to do. Okay, all good. But in a certain sense, the final goal, the one without which the human person cannot be satisfied, is to love well. And so how do these, first of all, education as training to love what we ought to love and to love it well. But then also doing, thinking, feeling, how does training in those things then actually relate to training in the ultimate thing?
Yeah. No, I mean, if we're going to say that education is a kind of spiritual exercise, then the way that education helps us to grow in the habit of loving, as you say, like that's the most important thing. And I think maybe that's, for some people, that's not obvious. Maybe that's debatable. There's a long argument that like, well, I don't need to go to school to love God. I don't need to read theology to be devout. I don't like kind of a long maybe not long. There's a tradition of kind of thinking that knowing and loving God or loving your neighbor are separate things.
Right.
They're not related. You could call it a kind of pietism.
Right. Anti-intellectualism.
Anti-intellectualism.
What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I wonder if Tertullian's problem was love or not, but
fair enough. I won't take us down that rabbit hole.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, like a kind of anti-intellectualism. But that kind of an anti-intellectualism is foreign. It's foreign to the Catholic tradition. It's certainly foreign to the vision of Aquinas or Bonaventure, some of the church's great scholars. For them, there's a close connection between exercising your intellect and exercising your will in acts of loving neighbor, but above all, loving God. And I guess for Aquinas, you could put it like this: a thing has to exist before you can know it. Truth is a description of the real, so you can only know something that exists first. But a thing has to be known before you can love it. You can only love the things that you know. And so it's true that you don't have to be a theologian to love God. That's 100% true. I'm sure that God has as many theologians as he wants. But on the other hand, I think we could use this analogy. I love my wife, and I couldn't love my wife if I didn't know her first. And it might be possible for someone to love God without being a theologian. That's for sure possible. But it's not possible for them to love God without knowing anything about God. And if you know a little bit about God, and you love him very intensely, that's great. That's very good. But the more you learn about God, the more new ways you can love God. So, like, I remember one time, Savith and I, I don't know, we had a small, spat in the car, and I was a little annoyed. And we went to the supermarket, and I said to myself, instead of feeling annoyed, I'm going to walk into the supermarket with Sabitha and, just hopefully I get over it. And we walked, kind of to the tea aisle, and she was excited that they had the kind of tea she wanted. And she did a little dance because they had the tea she wanted. I was like, oh, wow, that's really sweet. And I knew a new thing about Sabitha, that she has a little dance that she does for tea. And I could love her for that. A whole new thing about her that I could love, a whole new way that I could love my wife. And everything that we learn about God becomes a whole new way, a whole new thing that we can love about God, a whole new way that we can love God. So everything that we understand with our intellect, everything that we know, can become a new thing that we love God for. This, I've kind of ventured into the realm of St. Bonaventure. This was St. Bonaventure's great argument. Bonaventure was a kind of a colleague of Thomas Aquinas. They were at the University of Paris around the same time. But Bonaventure, he belonged to the Franciscans, the kind of original, you don't have to study theology to love God, maybe anti-intellectual, maybe not. And so he had to justify to them the fact that he was studying theology without making it sound like he thought that he was holier than they were, because he knew better than that. And the way that he does it, he has this book called De Reductione Artium ad Theologiam, which means all of the sciences, all knowledge points back to God, points back to theology. And what he does is he says, for all the different things that you could study, you could read the Bible, you could study the practical sciences, technology. He called it the mechanical arts. You could study philosophy or the liberal arts or the things that we study in school. For anything that you study, you're studying something that God has made. And when you reframe your studies through the lens that this is something not just that's real, now I know how to reduce an elementary equation, not just as something that's real, but you study it as something that springs from the mind of God, that God made, that God did, then that gives you a whole new thing to be grateful to God or to be in awe and wonder towards God about. And so I want to be a little careful about this. What he says is, it's not the case that we should add or force or shoehorn God into a subject so that we're making something to be about God that isn't already about God. you wouldn't, St. Bonaventure doesn't want you to teach math differently than math would normally teach the facts about math. But then kind of think about or be aware of the idea that math has its origin in God's mind. That before anything had been created, math, the ideas, the existence of number existed in God. And so now you know something more about the way that God orders the world. And that can cause awe. I don't know. I think awe is underappreciated. And in the world of making education a spiritual exercise, awe has a lot of power, a lot of potential. And by awe, what I mean is the kind of moment when something suddenly fits together. You're solving a math problem and suddenly it reduces in a beautiful way. And you're like, oh, wow, that's cool. You see a little trace of God's order, the order by which God fashioned the world, show up in a place you didn't expect. Or you look through a microscope and you see how intricate a cell is. Or you learn you're doing a chemical equation and you see how the precipitate comes out from the chemical equation in just this particular way. Moments where completely unexpected, you see order. Bonaventure would say that order is a reminder that God was here first, that the world that we're glimpsing, the way that God's word has shaped the world. And we encounter it in any field of study, showing up maybe in unexpected ways. And when we do, it's important, it's helpful, it's essential to call our students' attention to that and say, guys, isn't this cool? Sometimes it might seem hokey, but I've done that myself and just kind of said, isn't it cool how X, Y, or Z? And then at the end of the semester or sometime later in my student evaluations or something, they'll write, I really appreciated how he pointed to us to like take a second and appreciate the beauty of what we're learning. One of the ways that we can habituate our students in the spiritual exercise of loving God through their studies is just kind of stop and be grateful, have a moment for awe, and say, wow, I can see the kind of the footprints of the Trinity right here in what we're looking at.
Awesome. I'm just imagining conversations I've had with my kids when something clicks. Right now we're having lots of conversations about etymology because we have an English learner in our household.
Yeah.
And so we'll use a word and we'll say, Eriko, do you know that word? And if she doesn't know it, then we have to like describe it and relate it to other words and see what kind of words there might be in Japanese and how they make the same meaning or whatever. And when it makes sense, it's just so satisfying. It's just so incredible. And kids love it. And I think what you were saying, isn't this cool? One of the things that can happen to kids in education is they can get jaded because knowledge, they're like not sure what it's for. If you have this, to go back to one of our main themes from near the beginning, like this productivist attitude, then something being cool is like irrelevant.
Yeah, that's
like,
right.
What's it for? How can I use it? How can I make money with it?
And that's what's so frustrating is that like the spontaneous reaction of seeing something really beautiful or really cool is to say, wow, that's cool, right? That's what happens spontaneously.
Right.
But if you are in a artificially flattened classroom, if for whatever reason you're disciplined out of saying, this is cool, this is awesome, this is moving, this is inspiring, this is beautiful. You can condition people out of saying that. And then that saps some of the joy from the learning experience. It saps some of the life from the classroom.
Right. And to go to where this started,
Yeah, yeah.
makes it harder to love.
Right.
When you're jaded,
Yeah,
it's
that's
just
right.
harder to love, right?
Like if your kid, like right now, one of our kids is learning to walk. So if your kid like takes their first like journey halfway across the living room before tipping over, right? And no one says anything, right? Like, that's harsh, right? Like that's disordered. But the natural reaction to that is to be like, wow, that's cool. You did the thing. That's good job, little buddy. Keep doing it. And then like every time they kind of like make a little further journey through the family room, the rest of my kids are like, yeah, good job. But if we had like squelched that, if we had like by our inaction or by our refusal to be moved, my wife and I had said nothing, and then the kids would have been like, I guess we don't get excited about this anymore. Then imagine like an environment where some kids learning to walk and no one expresses any excitement about that at all.
Right.
You can deaden enthusiasm by not encouraging it at the right and at the natural times.
Right.
And a lot of education, that happens. And so it can be a kind of Catholic counter witness to say, guys, this is beautiful. Let's just take a minute and revel in it.
Right.
To habituate that act of love and awe.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Someone gave me, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but it was a teacher who said that he conceived of his job as a teacher as helping people to enjoy good things. Like
Yeah.
that was his framework. We're like, that's what I do when I teach, is just help them to, and I was like, yeah, that's pretty right.
That's to know what is good and then to enjoy it. I mean, those are acts of knowing, of loving, and of feeling, and choosing. That's everything.
Right. Right. Awesome. Andy, thank you so much for joining me today. It's always a delight to talk to you. Hopefully we'll do it again someday. Thank you everyone for watching, and God bless.